Hi, everybody. It's Crystal Edwards here, Care Conversations with Crystal. I have a guest today, Ron Mowad of Bradley Funeral Homes. I'm so excited that he has agreed to join us today to talk about funeral planning and pitfalls and pre-planning, just kind of the need to know, so to speak, in the funeral space. So I'm going to hand it over to Ron to give us a bit of a background about him and also to tell us a little bit about his virtual background.
Hi, Crystal. Thank you. Really looking forward to this, so it should be a lot of fun. So when Crystal talks about background, she was talking about me personally, my little resume. But what I like to do, I like to play with toys. I like to talk about what's called the virtual background. On Zoom, you don't want to see what's really behind me right now. But if I want to change this and maybe make it a little more relaxed, we can do that. But I better not, because that water noise is gonna, you know what. So I want to go back to the background that you just saw with the cemetery, and the casket here. There's a top of a vault here, and this is a military honors guard. And I'm gonna come back to this, but this is not a canned stock background. This was back 5 years ago, my father's actual funeral, which I'll talk a little bit more about when we talk about pre-planning and things that we can do. So that's kind of the meaning behind using this background.
Awesome.
My resume background. I've been a funeral director over 40 years, and over 20 of those years, I have specialized in pre-planning or advanced planning, doing arrangements ahead of time, quite extensively. Spent a lot of time doing that. But unfortunately, as we'll talk about, the past few months, I've spent more time back taking care of issues with death care when someone's passed away because of what had happened with COVID. It was just so busy. So, but that's the long and the short. Over 40 years as a licensed funeral director and over 20 years as a pre-planning funeral director where we pre-plan.
Now, Ron, one of the things that people will often ask me is, how do I make sure that my funeral gets paid for, and what can I do up front to kind of facilitate the process? So they come in two flavors, right? We've got the folks who don't want to talk about the death and dying process. They don't want to talk about planning for their funeral because, as soon as they do that, they think that all of a sudden the Grim Reaper is going to come and take them out.
Right.
And then you've got the other folks that want to do absolutely everything humanly possible to make it so easy that all you have to do is pick up the phone. Clients who will write their obituaries, for example, and write their kind of script of what their last words or wishes may be. So how does someone go about pre-planning for their funeral?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad, because that's the first part I want to answer. Obviously, cost is important, and financial planning and such. But basically, how do you go about pre-planning? It's a simple conversation. Having a conversation with a licensed funeral professional, funeral director, and just describing what you would want for funeral services for yourself and what you would think your family would like for you. Because you got to remember, funeral service is not just for you, it's for your family. So once we have that conversation, we're simply going to jot down all the necessary information about you, we'll call vital statistics, death certificates, family information for an obituary, and your life story to write a nice tribute about you. If you're a veteran, for example, veteran services, we're going to write all that down. Once you have decided what type of services you would want, that's when we talk about cost. Cost is predicated on what we do, what you want, like anything. The more you want, the more the cost, the less you want, the less the cost. However, it's a very sensitive topic in a few areas. A lot of people don't want to talk about it. You're right, because they think if they do, they're going to die. Uh, well, that's kind of like saying when I get my car insurance and drive out to the street, I'm going to have an accident. It doesn't mean you have something that's going to happen. Uh, but I'm going to segue right into the financial aspect. And this may sound canned and taped and recorded. I don't want, when a death occurs, to say, I'm sorry, Crystal, but we need to ask you for payment. It may sound like I don't mean it, but I mean it. As a funeral director, the worst thing to have to do is ask for monies when a death has occurred. So let's segue to what we call a prepaid funeral. And what is that prepaid funeral? What's the definition? Well, in New Jersey, we need to call it a prepaid funeral by law. Well, you might say to yourself, prepay? I am not giving that funeral home 1 cent of my money at all. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't do it. But what prepaying means is to prearrange so we know what the details are and what the cost is. The details are just as important, if not more important, than cost. And then for the funeral home to establish a third-party funeral fund in the consumer's name. There's a couple different types of funds and different types of benefits, what's right for everyone. But the point is that funeral home will never see 1 penny of those funds until we're called upon to do the funeral service. And that also takes us to transferability. Just because you pre-plan with one of the Bradley family funeral homes, for example, we have 5 funeral homes, plus a cremation service that we serve the whole state of New Jersey. You may decide to go to another funeral home in a part of the state or another part of the country. Not only is your money 100% transferable with the growth of it, but all the details are transferable. And we'll help you with that when you want to transfer. So to kind of summarize it, pre-planning is prearranging what details you want, recording it, having the funds in place so that ultimately you'll get the type of funeral service you want and what your family would want. And ultimately, financially, your family will not be burdened with having to deal with high costs in the future, having to deal with exchanging monies at the time of a death.
So, Ron, one of the things that I heard you say with that, right, with prearranging and prepaying and making sure that what you want is in place, oftentimes people are concerned about disagreements or disruptions within their family. Um, it's always easy for mom and dad to keep the kids in line when they're alive, but when the kids are gone, then folks start to run amok and argue about who got the bigger piece of cake every year for, their birthday. So based on that, what happens practically, so not legally, but just practically, if I prearrange my services and I make certain decisions about what I want, and now I'm gone and my kids are there, and let's say they're not fighting, they all agree that I chose cremation and it's against their religion or our collective religion, and they want burial. What happens in those circumstances?
Okay, so we've been at a lot of seminars together we gave and hope to keep giving virtually. But you talk about what happens when someone dies without a will and die intestate, and what happens, who's in charge, so to speak, who can apply to be administrator, and so on. Well, it's very similar when you pass away. When you pass away, your immediate next of kin, bloodline, or other legal appointee is in charge of what happens with your remains, even if you've pre-planned it and prearranged it, believe it or not, and prepaid it. So in order of descent, if you will, if there was a civil union, a spouse, there's no civil union, no spouse, then a majority of adult children. If there's no adult children, then it would be your parents, if there's no parent or parents, it would be your siblings, down to nieces and nephews and cousins, and then there's that legal term you always say I can't pronounce for something.
For sure piece.
It would go right down the line. Uh, and
So
it does get very contentious sometimes.
yeah, and so with that, what I'm hearing is that not only if you have certain desires that you should prearrange, but you should also communicate that with your family.
Right,
Is that all possible to iron out some of those issues before those days actually come? So one of the things that also comes up is life insurance.
right.
People think about life insurance a lot when paying for their funeral.
Mm-hmm,
If I have a life insurance policy that I really want to be used to pay for my funeral,
mm-hmm.
I just assign it over to the funeral home, or like what's the best way to fund other than with cash?
Okay.
I want to
So,
prepay.
sure. And obviously the best way is case by case by case. There's so many little nuances, especially with life insurance. As we all know, life insurance is an asset. Years ago, people bought it with the idea that the cash value would be like savings, and it's going to be for my funeral.
Mhm.
Uh, and it can be. We can take proceeds of a life insurance policy. However, there may be fees to do that. The insurance company may not release those funds in time for the burial. This grave behind me, when I had to open it for my father, it was $2,300 to open. So, you know, we and that was a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
So we needed to have funds in place. So if you're going to use life insurance, that's okay, but make sure that that company, the life insurance company, will allow what they call an assignment. Know what the fees are going to be to do that assignment, and don't forget about what it's called, life life insurance. So who's going to pay the rent, the mortgage, the taxes, groceries, unreimbursed medical bills, and all these other needs? Who's going to pay that? You want to make sure there's enough money there to do that. So we're going to segue for a minute. There's basically two ways to pre-fund a funeral other than life insurance. And that is what we call a funeral trust fund, which is like a bank account with very good interest, fund that we use, and or a funeral insurance company, not your general commercial life insurance company. Not every funeral home will use that, but we do. So Bradley Funeral Homes made that decision. And what that funeral insurance fund will do will ensure or guarantee to lock in whatever you pay for our services and merchandise. You'll never pay more in the future. As I said earlier, you're not paying a funeral home. It's monies that are still in your pocket, so to speak. They're your assets. You never have them. It's just that you diversified them. You had some insurance policies, some bank accounts. Now you've taken some money from a bank account, for example, and put it in a prepaid funeral account. But as you know, these are all assets, which I think probably be a good little segue to you of why pre-planning is important also. Prepaying is important.
Definitely. And one thing that I do want to highlight, because I love talking to some of our service partners, right? Folks who we work with regularly on various issues, because you never sell yourselves the way that you really should. So one of the things that I'll mention for everyone else, because Ron has not mentioned it yet, is that personal touch, right? So we talk about, you know, the technical stuff of how do we plan and how do we pay. But at the end of the day, we end up dealing with families at their most vulnerable point. And so having that personal touch of, I think Austin at Bradley Funeral Homes often talks about the cookies, right? The
Right, right.
grandmother who loved to make cookies, and so instead of potentially prayer cards, it was recipe cards. Things like that kind
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
of way
yeah.
ultimately to kind of smooth out the process and make it easier. It's never easy, but make it as easy as possible for families. I'm going to ask you what some people may think is a strange question, but it has come up when we have spoken in the community about these issues. If someone has prearranged,
Mhm.
everything is done, and everyone in the family knows that they are to call Ron at Bradley Funeral Homes.
Mhm.
If mom or dad expires at home, what should they do first? Should they call you?
Absolutely. So that we can kind of soften the process for them and what's going to happen. If there's hospice involved with a hospice nurse to come make what's called the death pronouncement, um, it's always good for us to know ahead of time that you're waiting for that hospice nurse. But the other side of it is if you're not on hospice and there's an unattended death at home, meaning a nurse, a doctor, and so on, regardless of what your medical condition is, how severe it may have been, we have to go through the routine of notifying the police, EMS, paramedics, medical examiner, and it's all routine where it's simple questions. Yes, dad's been ill. I treated him for a heart condition. The doctor will say, and the doctor will say, I'll sign that death certificate. So not a problem. But in the meantime, you still have to go through that whole EMS, police, paramedics. If you're a town like mine, fire department or first responder and medical, you've got police car, fire truck, ambulance, paramedics, you know, on your street. Uh, so we can soften them and let them know what to expect. And especially they call in advance, we let them know. But hopefully they call us first and we'll let them know what they need to do to kind of walk them through it, hold their hand, and take away some of the minutia that's going to be going on.
Got it. Well, one of the things that I want everyone to think about and remember, especially of Ron's comments today, is about what happens if you don't plan, or ultimately what happens if you do plan, but there are disagreements among the family. We have something in New Jersey called the appointment of a funeral representative. It's a funeral and disposition representative, because we just like legal terms to be a mouthful for people to say. And so, unfortunately, in New Jersey, that appointment can only be made in a will. But ultimately, what it does is it lets your family, but most importantly, it lets the funeral home know who should they listen to and who should they take direction from in
Right.
the event of any type of disagreement among the family.
Right.
So if you and one of your children are on one accord and the other two think that you're rogue for wanting XYZ type of disposal of your body, then you know which child to appoint for purposes of making those decisions. If you have any questions for Ron, how can people contact you, Ron?
Okay. So if I may close with a quick story behind me.
Oh, yeah, certainly.
Uh, so thank God my father made it almost 98 when he passed away. And
Wow.
when my mom passed away 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I first started, there was no such thing as pre-planning. And when she died, we found us at this cemetery picking this grave out, which was fortunately on the roadway. But for my father, it was a completely different story. There were five, I'm one of five siblings. And it was very interesting in the planning process because there were some difference of opinions, if you will. But ultimately, we knew what we were going to do, what we wanted. He passed away at about 3 in the morning in the middle of a major blizzard at home, no less. Uh, my father being the stubborn guy he is. Uh, but with that said, I called my colleague. We transferred my dad at 3 in the morning. By 7 in the morning, we knew exactly what the arrangements would be, when they would be, where they would be, the visitation, the mass, the cemetery. We arranged for the military honor guard, which is a very nice tribute for a veteran. So this was a true story. Very, goosebumps still of what pre-planning does for tranquility for the family. It's dollars are important, but they mean nothing compared to the peace of mind and relaxing atmosphere, if there's such a thing. So with that said, I may be reached at the Bradley Funeral Homes, or 5 locations, And that phone number is 973-635-2428, extension 139, or my email is Ron, it's my first name, R-O-N, at Bradley Funeral Homes. Homes is plural, so Bradley Funeral Homes is all one word, .com. And as Crystal will tell you, I'm always available. I even use my cell phone and text quite often.
Always available, always.
So thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Ron, for joining us today. You can reach me, as always, 973-889-4263, or at our brand new website, www.porzioplanning.com. Any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to contact Ron or I. The contact information is below. Until next time, have a good day.